On today's episode of the ThriveMore podcast, I have the pleasure of interviewing Glenn Poulos. He's the author of Never Sit in the Lobby. What a great title. And it's a sales book that really explores 57 different factors on what makes a great salesperson. So not only are you going to learn a lot during this podcast, but Glenn's got some great stories and is just an incredibly pleasant person. I think you'll really like this. I have the pleasure of speaking with Glenn Poulos. Glenn is the Vice President and General Manager of NWS. It was formerly Gap Wireless. It's a leading product and service distributor for the mobile broadband and wireless markets. But why he's here today is because he's the author of Never Sit in the Lobby. It's a book inspired by his 30 years of experience in the trenches as a salesperson and as a sales manager. He's the host also of the podcast Profit Powerhouse. And he really is a true expert when it comes to the discipline of sales. So we're going to get all his insights today. So let's go ahead and get to it. Glenn, welcome to the ThriveMore podcast.
Hi, Roger. Thank you so much for having me today.
To kick things off, can you share your background and how you got into sales and you really dedicated your life to the profession of selling, which I can tell you I think sales makes the world go round. So I'm already a fan that you've dedicated your life to this. And obviously, you've written this amazing book, Never Sit in the Lobby. Can you tell us how we got here? Like a little bit of your background.
Sure. No problem. When I was a teenager and what have you, I got involved like in sort of, this was in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
So, the technical stuff of that day, right? Car stereos and recording and things like that, right? And there were no computers or anything like that. But the moment they came out, I sat in on those as well. But, and I told my dad, hey, I'm going to install car stereos for a living. And he's like, no, I don't think so. He said, if you want to do the technical thing, fine, but why don't you go to school for technical things and get a real job, right? And I just loved anything electronic that, any kind of gizmo that connected to it. And it was just one of those, just didn't require any effort on my part. It was just a passion. And so I went to school for electronics. And before getting into sales, right in college, I got recruited by the Canadian government, and they wanted to send me to the Arctic to do electronic maintenance on their weather equipment. And basically, they were trying to save money. They wanted to, instead of sending weather techs and electronic techs, so they sent me off to weather school. I got my electronic diploma. I got a weather diploma, went off to the Arctic. And after a year of living on a weather station with five people, I said, get me out of here. And they sent me to head office, and I got plugging away in their electronics labs, working on equipment. And my boss, who's a former military guy, he retired and then he joined the government and the weather service. And he said, you're not in the right field. He said, you got to get out of here. He said, I think you should go into sales. And I never really questioned him on, why he was saying that or whatever. But my coworkers were always telling me I was working too fast. So that's probably a hint, right? And, and too many widgets per unit time, right? And so I after a couple of years working for the government, I applied for a sales job. And I kind of love to tell that story because I went for the interview. I'd never had no sales experience. And, the next morning I called the guy and I said, hey, did I get the job? And he goes, well, no, I'm still doing interviews. I'm like, okay. And so then that afternoon I called back and I said, hey, what about now? And I mean, honestly, this was quite genuinely naive of me. I just wasn't even thinking, right? The next day I called again. He wouldn't even take my calls. He was punting me to the secretary,
Sure.
right? And so after about a week or so, he said, we're sending you to Montreal to meet my business partners. And I'm like, okay, fine. And so I had been driving around the province of Ontario in Canada, fixing this government electronics, driving the cheapest, crappiest government car you could imagine. It was like this was in the 80s, and it was a Chevy Chevette or something, government green, crank windows, no air, no radio, when I fly to Montreal, the guy picks me up. He's in a BMW 750, right? And I'm like, oh, I definitely need to get a job in sales, right? And And so he pulls into the office to meet the other partners in this business. And there were 2 other matching 750s in the parking lot, and the license plates were all 1 digit apart.
Oh my
So
God.
they'd obviously gone one day to the dealer and bought 3 BMW 750s and got matching plates. And I'm like, wow, I'm definitely getting a job in sales, right? So I talked to the owners in Montreal, and they sent me back to Toronto, and the Toronto guy called me and said, okay, we're going to give you the job. And he hires me. And shortly after hiring me, he pulls me aside and he said, I got to tell you, you were not our first choice, right? He goes, actually, you weren't even on the list to be hired because you had such lack of skills in the, lack of experience and whatever. I'm like, okay, well, then why did you hire me?
Yeah.
Right. And he's like, well, you're the only guy who followed up twice a day for 10 days. And we just assumed that if you follow up that much to get a job, you'd follow up even more to keep a job, right? So we decided that, work ethic and what have you. So I got the job.
Yeah, you're doing lead nurture before you even knew what lead nurture was. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was just a natural, because I was I was just naturally motivated for the outcome, right? And so I worked with them for about 5 years. And I approached them on the eve of my 30th birthday. And I had this like burning need that I wanted to be an entrepreneur and I wanted to have my own business. And I saw how much money they were making as an owner and how much more leverage you get as an owner, because it's not just your own output, it's the output of you and all your other salespeople that you're profiting from, right? And I said, look, I'd like to spin off a small piece of your technology business that you're selling and focus on that while you focus on the broader electronic market. And, you can retain some ownership. I'll get some ownership and I'll go sign up some more vendors and, and then, I'll accomplish my goal. You'll accomplish yours. Right. And the president said, nah, that'll never work. And, because you can show me your plan, but you should stick to your knitting. And so the next day I resigned. Right. And, I'd only been married 6 days at the time too. And I forgot to tell my wife. And, I was so committed that I could make this thing happen. I just had the blinders on, right? And I just quit without a lot of thought, obviously. And I went at it, right? And it was this newfangled technology that they didn't think would go anywhere, and it was the cell phone, right? And as we all know, that never amounted to anything, right? Yeah. And so I went about with a business, and I ran that business for 15 years and I ended up selling it. And I then ended up starting another business, which I ran for another 15 years, which was Gap Wireless. And I then sold it to NWS Canada last year. And I agreed to stay on with them for a period of time, helping them run the Canadian operation. And that's kind of how I got here. And it's like 15 years, 5 years at the other one. It's like, and like 35 years in sales at this point now.
Wow.
And along the way, I mean, I wrote the book during the pandemic, but I started writing the rules down in the 80s when I got my first job.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So you started making these notes back in the 80s, and were these just notes to yourself to improve, to know, okay, the next call, I need to make sure I do this or I don't do that? What was the genesis of the note taking?
Yeah. So I ended up having this little leather brown notebook. And so I was out with one of the sales guys, Tony, right? And he had distributed a behavior or whatever. And I decided I was going to call it the Tony factor. Right. And I mean, there's a lot of names in the book if you read it, you know, and I had to change all the names actually. And the biggest problem I have is I can't remember the made up names in the book. I actually remember the victims. Right. And so I often get myself tongue tied there, but, so I would call them, the Tony factor, right? And it was a technique for how I handle like a request for a discount, or the guy wants a freebie, or how do I get in the front door? And so I started writing down rules to follow and rules to avoid, right? Like, don't do this, do that, and I just started writing them down. And then, around the water cooler, someone would say something. I go, oh, that reminds me of the Tony factor. And, and then they're like, what's the Tony factor? And then they go, oh my God, that's hilarious, or, what have you. Because a lot of the stories do end up coming out a little funny. And so that people, the way I tell them, it's so people will remember them, right? And then people would say, oh, tell this guy about that factor you told me about. And then, then a few companies that I worked with said, hey, you know what? We really love those stories. Can you come into our sales meeting and speak for an hour and, tell some of your other rules? And I'm like, okay, sure. And so I did that for a while. And then people started saying, oh, you should write a book. And of course, I never did write the book until the pandemic, right? Yeah. But I mean, I often had that ringing in my ear. And so I started writing them down. I just kept writing down. And every time I kind of saw a rule, I wrote down, as much of the punchline, if you will, of the rule and who I would attribute it to so that later I could, expand upon it. And ultimately, it became this whole, recipe book of things to avoid and things to try to copy in order to, as I like to say, my mantra is how to get, act, and stay in front of your customers and to be a pleasure to do business with always.
Okay. I love that it's 57 principles too. You can tell you didn't make that number up. Usually it's, the top 10 reasons or the, the top 5. 57 is a very odd number. What is the genesis of the book's title, Never Sit in the Lobby? Speak to that.
Yeah.
Please.
So I had, of course, you're writing the book and you're this genius in your own mind. And you're like, I'm like, oh yeah, factors, sales factors, how to win in business or something. I'm making up these names, and I had, of course, hire editors to help me. And, and that was where I learned that, even though maybe in common speech or whatever, you may use, you might swear a little bit or whatever, right? Especially in kind of sales around the law. But in the books, the first editor's like, you can't swear that much in a book. And I'm like, oh, okay, fine. And take those 4,000 words out and we'll, but the genesis was that I had made up this like very stagnant title, which I thought was good, but one of the copy or content editors was explaining to me that it wasn't like a searchable. It wasn't something that would hit the algorithms when people were searching for solutions for their problems, right? And that I had needed to do a better job. And one of them actually came up with the idea, and it's the rule, the never sit in the lobby is one of the core tenant rules in the first splash of rules that come out at the first part of the book. These rules come out like a landslide of do this, and this. And one of them is never sit in the lobby. Yeah. Right. And I love when a lot of people say to me like, oh, so, well, should I sit in my car? And I'm like, no, you shouldn't be sitting at all. You should be in the lobby standing up, and just don't show up too early so your feet don't get sore. And when that guy walks out, you're ready to say hello to him, greet him. And, and then one of the other rules is always have something in your hand and something in your mind. Right. So you're standing in the lobby, comes out, shake his hand. You've got something, which, I have there's a whole raft of things I explain in the book, like a quote or, a freebie item, like mouse pads and trinkets and things. But also in Canada, we're famous for our Tim Hortons donuts. Right. So as long as it's built before 10:30, always bring a box of donuts. Right. Sure. Never after 10:30, though, because then you wreck the guy's lunch and he gets mad at you. Right. And, so that's the genesis of the title. Was basically it's one of the rules, and it kind of has that little bit of a catchy vibe to it, like never sit in the lobby. And so that's how I came up with it. Well, actually I didn't come up with it. The editor came up with it. Yeah.
Always have something in your hand and always have something in your mind. That's great. Love it. I'm going to ask you about several of these principles, but if you were to talk about some of your favorites before I ask, what would some of your, if you had to distill it down and it was a top 5 book or whatever, what would those be?
Just in terms of like amusing myself or what have you, I love the ones that sort of spew out right at the very beginning in the book. So I already talked about never sit in the lobby and always show up with something in your hand and something in your mind, right? And then the other ones that sort of go along with it are always ask for a mini tour. Right. Yeah, and everyone's like, what's a mini tour? And I'm like, well, a mini tour is a tour that's mini. Right. And they're like, what are you talking about? Right. And I'm like, okay, if you go, like you go with your wife to a trip somewhere, you go on a tour, it's 4 hours long, you're getting on and off the bus, and by the end of it, you're tired, you need a nap. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
A mini tour is you're in the lobby, and, we always sold high tech items, so they were going to go somewhere. They're going to end up in the warehouse. They're going to end up in the lab. They're going to end up in the, in the engineering building, in the production building, on the production line. And so always try to find, this, you're probably dealing with a new setup. You're selling them new equipment for something. So let's say setting up a new production line. Hey, could I get a quick mini tour of your new production line? And because what you're trying to do is get past the front door, meaning the lobby, and get into the building so you can start to ask questions and see by virtue with your eyes what's happening in terms of, when you end up at that Purdue production line, are 9 of your competitors' boxes already there and installed and running? And are you just the guy to keep them honest, right? And or is it an empty greenfield? There's nothing there, and you could have the opportunity of supplying them all sorts of other things, but it's only through getting into the building that you see, hey, what are the logos on the shirts that the staff are wearing? What mouse pads and water bottles do they have on their desks? And that stuff just tells you volumes of, information about where you sit competitively, right? And later I talk all about, being number 1 or 2, or I'd rather be last than second, and those rules. But so you always ask for the mini tour, right? Then the next rule that goes with the mini tour is never forget a face, right? So the call book factor. So back in the 80s, of course, I had a call book where you wrote it all down, and they were on these little multi-ring binders, and you could flip quickly to your customer, and you could see all the names of everyone in that customer, and you could pop them in and out of the binder really quickly, and it was super efficient. And I even tell a story in the book where I got the first sort of Palm Pilot-y kind of a thing, and I show up at a sales meeting, and the president's like, "What's that piece of crap?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's the best thing. It's going to change the world, right?" And he's like, "What do you mean, right?" And I'm like, "Well, I can store all my customer names and phone numbers and notes and this and that." And he's like, "Oh yeah." I said, "All right." He goes, "Let's have a bake off." He goes, "I'm going to shout out a customer name, and I'm going to go in my call book. I'm going to find him, and you got to find him in your thing." And I'm like, "Okay, sounds good." Right. And of course he says, "Bob at Honeywell." Right. And then in 2 seconds, he's got the page open, his fingers on Bob. Right. I'm like hitting power. The battery was dead. The charger was up in my hotel room. Right. And he goes, he's like, "See, you lost." Right. And, but nonetheless, you have all the names in the call book, but when you're waiting to go into the lobby and not sit down, you're in your car and you flip to the call book, which nowadays is your phone or your laptop. Yep. And you, what I call remember people's faces. Okay. So, 5 or 6 people in that building, and it's like Sally, oh, that's the lady with the red hair. And then Jack, that's the tall guy, Bob's the bald guy. And if you can't see their face in your mind, go to LinkedIn and, look at their profile photo and remember their face. Move it from long-term memory to short-term memory. Okay. And this is the most powerful, it's the most simplest, but most powerful rule in the book, right? A lot of people skip it and like, "Oh, don't worry." But the problem is the time delay, because our brains work so fast. Even like the microseconds it takes you to go back and remember it, the person already thinks you forgot their name. Yep. Even if you do remember it like a microsecond or 2 later, the delay is offensive to them, right? And so I remember them before I enter the building. Remember, I asked for the mini tour. He says yes. If he says, "Oh," he hums and haws, then I say, "Look, I promise I won't sell any encyclopedias while I'm in the building." And usually get a laugh. Or I said, "Look, I just would like a quick tour just to see where, what things look like and get a better, so we can do, and usually they'll give you the tour, right? And then you're walking through the hall. Of course, what do you see? Sally, right? Red hair. "Hey, Sally, how's it going?" Bob, Jack, Sam, Joe, and this guy's like, "Holy, this guy knows everybody." Right. And of course, everybody's looking at him going, "I can't believe he remembered me. I haven't seen him in 2 years." Right. Yeah. And, I always like dealing with that Glenn guy. He's always so nice. Sure. And of course, I'm always trying to be a pleasure to do business with, always. Right. Yeah. And those are some of the rules, right? Where, I stack them all together at the beginning of the book, and they all form part of my behavior when I first enter into a customer's. And I always try to leave that customer engagement with the next engagement preset. So I don't need to prospect that particular thing later, right? Meaning I'm going to drop this off. Then later I'm going to follow up with you to find out my next thing. I'm like, hey, I'm actually back seeing Sally next week. So why don't I drop by for 10 minutes and we can go over what we talked off today, whether, and the other rule sort of in that little splash of rules at the beginning is, never fax the facts or ship the shit, right? Which of course I invented the rule back when the fax came out.
Sure.
But of course now it's even worse with email, right? People want instant information. And if somebody asks me for something, I'm like, hey, sure, no problem. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be in the lobby visiting Sally on Thursday. Can I? Oh, well, I'm really busy. And I'm like, well, why don't I just leave it in the lobby for you? And, and the guy's like, oh, okay, fine. You can leave it in the lobby. So Thursday comes, I go to the lobby. The secretary or the receptionist lady says, is he expecting you? And I'm like, yeah, he's expecting me. Yeah. He asked me for a quote and what have you. And she calls Jack, and Jack forgot that he told me that he was too busy to come down.
Of course.
And he comes down, and I've got something in my hand, something in my mind. I asked for the mini tour. I remember the face, and before I leave him, I'm saying, look, can I come back next week and see you? And now I already know that I've got another appointment set for that day.
Yep.
And, I just stack it all from there. And sometimes I'm scheduling a phone call. Sometimes I'm scheduling a visit. Sometimes I'm scheduling a Zoom call, a factory discussion with the engineers. It obviously varies what it is, but I try to stack them so that I don't have to have these days in the office figuring out what to do.
Yep.
Right. I'm always sort of in motion and, and just working through the deals that I've got and leveraging each one to the next.
Yeah.
Right.
I think in the book you mentioned that if you're going to have a office day, Thursday statistically is the best day to be. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a little pro tip for the audience.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I often tease like the sales guys when they tell me, I ask them which days, are their office days and whatever. And they'll say like, well, usually Friday and Monday. And I'm like, oh, so you have a 4-day weekend,
Sure,
right?
Sure.
Because you're not doing anything, right?
Yeah. There were some that jumped off the page at me, some of these factors. Talk about WSP. Talk about WSP if you could, please.
Yeah. So this one's a little controversial, and to be, for the audience, I had to rewrite it numerous times in order to get it to pass the NSFW guidelines. Right. And so, but in its core, it's pretty, it's kind of a well-known concept, but I don't think people give it enough thought, let's say. So, So the fundamental idea behind WSP, the winning sales presence, right, is your ability to be innately attractive to your audience, right? And so, and where the sort of eyebrows get raised is sort of the examples that I give in the book, right? And the one example in the book I give is I talk about there was a sales meeting and there was a bunch of people and we all went out to lunch, and there was a fancy car, a Mercedes GT, I think it was, at the front door. And there were 3 sort of like FBI looking dudes near the front desk that were deep in conversation. And there was this one other, which I'll get to in a second. Right. And so I'm like, okay, how many people in the audience, how many went for lunch? And everyone went out for lunch. Right. And I'm like, okay, how many people noticed that Mercedes GT walking in the front door? And like a small handful, group of people, but their arms shot up because they're car guys, and they're not going to not notice a Mercedes GT, right? And then I said, how many of you guys noticed the 3 guys standing at the front desk? We walked right by them, deep in conversation, suits, FBI looking guys, and almost nobody recognized them. And I'm like, okay. And then the third one, right beside them was the lady in the red dress. How many noticed her? Every hand went up, right? And so the point is that, they noticed her, men and women,
Sure,
because she was innately attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Just, you can't argue it. She was pretty, right?
Yeah.
She looked pretty, and attraction's not a choice, right? Like you can't choose to be attracted to something. You either are attracted to it or not. Mm-hmm. And a loudmouth, braggadocious salesperson who's pounding his chest about his greatest products in sliced bread is not attractive. Yeah. And so I challenge salespeople to what I call find the WSP, right? or show them the WSP, meaning show them the what that will be attractive in and of itself and sell the product for you, right? And because when you see something and you love it and you want it, like I went to Europe this summer with my wife and we went to the Gucci store and she saw this handbag, which she just had to have. To me, I didn't see it, right?
Sure, of course.
But to her, it was like a godly event, right?
Yeah.
Like it was like, how can you, like, that's the most amazing thing in the world. And it just, to her, it was just the most attractive thing. And it was just sitting there on a shelf. I would walk by it. I wouldn't even give it a second glance, right?
Yeah.
I'm saying we have to find those things in our products and show them to the customer and allow them to shine so that customers just want them. And really to not do the other thing, which is to be the braggadocious type of sales guy. Oh, it's the best thing. If you don't buy it soon, it's going to go out of stock and you're not going to, that's not attractive, right? And often, like in my presentation training and things like that, I talk about the punch and the perfect pitch and the close. And, and the punch is often that to get their attention and show them something that will be so innately attractive to their need that they're just clamoring on your words throughout your presentation that follows, right? Break their state, show them something, a video, something, rather than saying, hey, let me start with a factory, some PowerPoint slides about where our factory is located and how many staff there are. And,
Sure.
And so that's kind of the concept behind it, right?
Yeah.
And but it really is all boils down to the whole attraction is not a choice.
Yep.
Algorithm, right?
Yeah.
So,
very insightful. If you can speak to another factor, the power of three.
Yeah. So the power of three. That's one where, I mean, I gave lots of examples in the book, but.
Yep.
And I don't know what to say, but it just works, right?
Yeah.
So the power of three is kind of like the Goldilocks principle, right? Not too cold, this one's too cold, this one's too hot, this one's just right. Yeah. Good, better, best, right? Mild, medium, hot, right? There's just like thousands of examples in the world. And that's because for some reason, this whole power of three thing works, right? 4 is too many and 2 is not enough. Yep. And just like in my presentation, the punch, perfect pitch, and close, everything's divided into 3s, right? So first thing is you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Yep. That's 1, right? Break it up into 3 sections. If you need to do it, if you only have 2, then you need to expand on it to get to 3. And if you need 4, then you have too many and you got to have more than one visit. Yep. You got to break it down, right? And always try to give it to them in that whole good, better, best kind of a concept, and wrap your presentations using that little sort of trick. And it's just psychologically, engaging for the customer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really the basics of the power of 3, right?
Yeah. And I studied lots of pricing models, and that power of 3, where you want to position, depending on what you want them to choose, you can position that middle option pricing wise.
Yeah.
Higher or lower,
right,
to get to force. Yeah. It's the psychology is amazing.
Yeah. There's a lot of marketing data written around that pricing principle in power of 3 for sure.
Yeah. This one I love, just the name of it. Freedom begins with no. Talk to that.
Yeah. So again, I had to, right off the top of my head, I actually can't even remember the example that I used in the book, but I had so many other examples and the editors kept deleting them. They're like, no, you can't use those. And, but the whole idea behind the freedom begins with no. And I mean, so often with the sales guys, like the example I like to give, when people ask me about it, is that you've gone through this negotiation with the customer and, they said they needed a final quote and whatever. And so you said, hey, can I drop it off? I'm going to be in the lobby. And they're like, I'm busy, bring the donuts, et cetera, et cetera. Don't sit in the lobby. And the guy finally shows up, got the quote. And then he looks at it and, he either calls you behind, into the boardroom, or he calls you back or what have you. And he says, well, that's great, Glenn, but, in order to get this deal over the line, we're going to need another 3%, right? Now, of course, you're well past you've already negotiated it all. You've typed it up on the letterhead and it's all fancy. And I'm not talking about the first day. I'm talking about you're at the finish line, right? Yep. And the guy says, I'm going to need 3%, right? The problem is the sales guy who who says, oh, okay, well, maybe I can speak to my manager, but I'm not gonna be able to authorize that here on the spot, but it's only a 40-minute drive back to the office. So let me take on all that stress by saying, yes, I will check it out and drive back with my tail between my legs to ask my boss for the discount I know that we can't offer, only for him to question why I said maybe, right? And whereas in the alternative is, well, Glenn, we're going to need 3%, to get this deal across the line. Do you think you can comply? And I'm like, well, I'm sorry, no, because I mean, based on the previous, negotiations or whatever, we've come in with our best price. We're not going to be able to go any lower. And as a matter of fact, you said the production line needs to be up in 8 weeks. That our production time is 6 weeks. Our production cycle begins if I don't get the order in by Tuesday, we'll miss our window, and then I won't hit your 8-week production start time. So not only can I not give you a discount, if I don't get an order today or by the Friday, I mean, I'm not going to be able to hit your delivery.
Yeah.
And at that moment, I'm free, right? Yeah. And so the other example I like to give to people, when you were kids or whatever, people would say, oh, can you give me $5? And it's like, oh, no, I can't afford it. Or no, I don't have it. Right. And just the way people are or whatever, like, especially, growing up in the time I did, when people said, no, I can't afford it, you didn't question it. It's like, you can afford it, blah, blah, blah. No, it's like, that was like, no, I don't have any money. Like, get out of here and leave me alone. Right. And so just by saying no, I'm now free. I don't have to find the money. I don't have to borrow the money to give it to you. I don't have to worry about getting the money back. And so, yes is when your problems start, right? Can you do this? Can you improve the delivery? Oh yeah, let me see if I can do that, right? And now you got to call the factory and you got to get back to them, and no, I can't. It's like, no, it's 8 weeks. I'm sorry. We got to get the order in right away. And that's where the freedom begins with no, right? Yeah. And I mean, you can just sort of cycle through millions of examples, of where saying yes just causes you problems. Yeah. And it's only your sort of like insecurities that cause you to not say no, right? Yep. And you need to say no, but for some reason you can't get the words out, right? But it's very freeing once you do. Yeah. It becomes back on the customer's plate. I got to get the order in by Friday or I'm not going to hit my delivery window, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so that's the whole idea behind freedom begins with no.
Oh, that's great. It's great. Great factor, great principle. This principle, this factor, as you call them, just jumped off the page. You only get forever to make another impression.
Right.
Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So often if that doesn't come up in a talk or whatever, people say, is there anything you want to end with? I always end with that one, right?
Yeah.
Most people, when I say that to them, they're like, no, I mean, my mom said, you got to make a good first impression.
Yeah,
and that's important. And I go, you're right. And I said, and then I want you to make every other impression a first impression. Right. And so the example that I give in the book is the sales guy, and, he's at his desk and he's prospecting. It's Monday or Friday, which he uses for prospecting. Right. And the boss comes in, walks by his desk, and he hears him at the last minute, and he's on Facebook. Right. So he alt tabs, on PC, right? You alt tab over to the CRM, and out of the corner of the eye, the sales manager or whatever sees the guys on Facebook, right? And, he doesn't make any note of it or whatever. Then a couple weeks later, he's walking by that guy's desk, and the guy hears his footsteps, and he alt tabs off of Instagram, and now he's over to the CRM and like looking busy. And that guy's now a permanent bum in the mind of the sales manager, sure. Right? But the power is actually, doing the opposite, right? So one, don't ever do anything at work that doesn't make you look better every time, right? It's not easy, right? And I'm not saying, like you're never going to go on Facebook or something like that, but do it. First of all, try to do it on your break or, when you're away from your desk. But quite the contrary. Like I'm saying, you want to be listening for that guy's cars, for the engine of the boss's car, and that distinctive car door slam that you hear when he hits the front parking spot. And when you hear the car pull in the driveway, in the parking lot, you're already not only not on Facebook, but you're actually deeply involved in a highly important task. And when he walks by, ask him for a piece of information. I'm working on this proposal for Honeywell for, $50K. And, do you mind if I pick your brain about something, right? And, and always be on, always be. And it also applies very much. I share this a lot with new guys, new salespeople about trade shows, right? Trade shows is one of the best places to make a really crappy impression on all your coworkers, right? Because some of the seasoned sales guys, they're sitting down in the booth, their feet are sore, they're complaining, they're drinking coffee. I'm saying when you're in that booth, if there's no customers, you want to be doing one of two things: standing in the aisle, pulling the customers in, or talking to every one of the factory reps that's in your booth, the bosses, the engineers, the application guys, the product specialists, the marketing guys. Tell me what's good about this product in the booth. Give me a 5-minute primer on what makes it so awesome, and never be off, right? And those impressions that the bosses, some senior guy from head office and you're from the region and you're meeting together in the trade show booth, that is a permanent impression you're going to make on that guy for a lifetime. That Glenn guy, he's always on. And I saw him in the booth. I've never seen anything like it.
Yep.
If he wasn't like getting product training while Jack and Bob were sitting down, drinking coffee, he was in the friggin' aisle pulling people in.
Yeah.
And that's about what I mean about making an impression, right? And it can really change the progress of your career, right? And I counsel people like, you want to start in a business where you can map your way all the way to where you need to be, and how you're going to get there. And, basically making a good impression every time is really you want to be the obvious choice, right? For every step of the way, go from junior sales to salesman, to senior sales, to sales lead, to team lead, to sales manager, to director of sales, to VP of sales, executive VP of sales, and then chief sales officer or what have you, whatever your goal in life is. And and so that's what I mean by you only get forever to make another impression.
Yeah. Sage advice. Great advice. Last one here. I've got some other questions for you, but the last one, the last factor, be your customer's best sales rep. Not to be confused with be your company's best sales rep, be your customer's best sales rep. Speak to that.
Yeah. So one of the top sales guys I've worked with, Mike, I mean, he really deserves all the credit for inspiring me to write that rule down and to follow it. And so essentially what we're saying is that, first of all, if you're struggling to get in to see the client, let's say he's an engineer, like we're selling to engineers, right? So I'm always trying to get in to see the engineering manager, director of engineering, and they're not always easy to get a hold of, right? So if I can't get a hold of them, I call the sales manager instead. And the sales manager, of course, being a salesman, he's a pushover and he's going to want to help you, right?
Sure,
and I mean, it's not universally true, but it's pretty universally true, right? And they usually, no, don't even worry about him because his number one guy is the lead hand, and call that guy. And, and as a matter of fact, hey, can I drop off some swag to you and maybe you can introduce me? Sure, no problem. And, that kind of a thing, right? But moreover, the best way to learn to sell things to your customers, to learn what your customer sells to their customers and help them to sell their products to customers. And so at its simplest form, you're calling on a company, they make widgets, right? You sell products that test widgets and you say, hey, that's an interesting widget. And think about what piece of information could I give to anyone in their company to help them sell widgets, right? Like, it could be as simple as, hey, your brother-in-law works for a company that buys widgets, and you could give them a lead and say, hey, and connect the two. But I give a very real world example of where I connected it across 2 or 3 companies and got this one selling to this one buying from this one, ended up signing a new vendor as a result of it. And when you start to become revenue generating for that business, they're going to want to retain the friendship and the relationship by buying products from you.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, he found me he's already given me 3 sales leads on where we can sell our products. 2 of them have panned out. And if I don't buy his product, he's going to go sell it to someone else.
Sure.
And he's going to go find stuff for them to sell. So that's the idea behind it, right? It's not always simple and easy, right? Especially, depending upon what you're selling. But there's often ways you can help them that's not just merely them selling a product, but it could be improving a process or reducing a cost or something like that. And being an advocate for their profitability, not your own.
Yeah. I consider myself in sales today, even though I'm a CEO. I've been in sales my whole life, and I've done big, $15 million deals and all the way down to $200 memberships. I never thought about, when I was calling on some of these Fortune 100 companies, going through their sales department to get to their technical buyer. That's the most brilliant thing you've said on this podcast. Like that's, if I could rewind my life 30 years, oh my gosh.
Oh yeah, it works so good.
I never even thought about that.
Amazing.
I've
used that hundreds and hundreds of times. Yeah.
Kids, listen to that one, because yours
There's
truly
one
missed it.
other part of that rule as well is people are like shaking their heads, maybe saying, I don't know. I mean, that sounds a little BS-y or whatever. Like, well, what's the only phone line in the company that always gets answered, right? The sales department, right? Yeah.
You're right.
Hi, can I speak to somebody in sales? No, we don't want to sell you anything today. Click.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Just brilliant. When you were, we have a lot of listeners that are founders, or they're entrepreneurs, or people that are about to become an entrepreneur, I should say. They're right on the edge there. You started, you shared, you quit your job after being married for 6 days. Like, that took guts. There's a lot of people that, fear gets in the way. And it really sounds like throughout your career, you've been able to manage that fear. Just everything you've said today and the way that you navigate through the sales universe, you seem to have a command over that emotion of fear. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways of answering it too, and but the one I love to share as well is that so you're sort of talking about my fear of failure, right? But I have a bigger fear, right? And I mean, like, some people raise their eyebrows when I say this, but I mean, I have a bigger fear of being poor, right? And it's kind of like in my DNA. Like, I literally mean I'm scared of being poor. Right. And I mean, as a joke, I like to explain to people, like, for example, I won't eat craft dinner. And they're like, well, why? And I go, because it makes me feel poor. Or I will eat it, but only if it's a side with something else. You know what I mean? Like, if it's like a macaroni salad or something like that, I'll eat it. Right. And it's and so I'm always driven to, to try to ensure my own success, because the alternative would be to be poor. So I'm being compelled by another fear, which is because fear is a good motivator, right? But I'm not scared of failing, right? And I mean, failing is just sort of redirecting you on the way, right? And I mean, there's no real failure, right? Because I mean, it's just something didn't work out and then you rejig and then you keep moving on. It's not like you failed, you're dead, you're dead, right? Like, it doesn't work that way, right? For the sake of brevity, I didn't explain in the middle of my career, I sold the one company, but my second deal, I did an all cash deal with a US private equity firm. It was a great exit, but my second one was also a great exit. I became a multimillionaire overnight, but I took an all stock deal in a public company that ended up being kind of a corporate raider type company. And they bought our company. We traded our equity for shares. And myself and my 2 partners were multimillionaires on paper, but couldn't sell because we were insiders. And within 18 months, they'd sucked every dime of cash out of our business. We were in receivership, and the shares ultimately went to zero, and I was broke. And I had to start over. And that's why I had to create a second company, which I then sold for cash 15 years later.
Smart man.
And so I had a huge upset 15 years in, right? Yeah. And most people are like, well, oh my God, how did you even survive that or whatever? And I'm like, well, because I was so scared of being poor, a week later, I started a new company. And I vowed that I would never do it the same way twice.
Yeah.
And so success for me, or being a leader for me, is always making the decision despite the adversity that you're faced with, right? That's the true sign of a leader. And that's what your staff are looking for. Like, it's fine to make a decision when there's all record profits and you're going to go invest in X, Y, or Z. Nobody, but when you're struggling and you might have to do a small restructuring or something like that, that's when your decision-making ability really, the rubber meets the road with that particular leader, right? Your people want to follow someone. They want to follow someone that at least at surface appears to know what they're doing and can make definitive, decisions for the company and explain it to them in a cogent manner, right? Yep. This is what we're going to do, et cetera, right? The other example I give about fear and decisions and just taking, even when you're scared, we were running the company I just sold. We had grown to 80 people in 2019. We'd got into several businesses that we shouldn't have. The reverse Midas touch, it's in the book. Just because you're successful at this doesn't make you a rocket scientist, right? You don't get a God-given right to be successful in everything just because your first business worked, right? And that's what happened to us. I made the decision. I told, I love telling this story. I came to my partner on a Monday morning at 8 a.m. and I said, Mark, in order to turn around this loss we've incurred because of the service debacle or whatever, we're going to go from 80 people to 29 people. He's like, oh my God, how are we going to do that? And I said, I'm going to explain it to you. And he goes, well, how long is that going to take? And I said, we're going to be done by 10 a.m. And we had already spoken to a company about buying the part of the service division, and that was actually 40 people, right? There was another division we were negotiating with about 6 people or something, but nonetheless, we only had to lay off a few people. They all got jobs, and we went on to record profits for 3 years in a row. And then, of course, using the multiples and the private equity, bought the company in 2022 for what we considered to be sort of a record win. And we probably or potentially could have, become insolvent if we didn't right the ship back in 2019. And my partner said, like, I never would have dreamt up the decision you made. I never would have been able to make that decision, and to do it all in a matter of a few hours and to pull that trigger. Like, thank you for forcing us to do that. And that's what a leader has to do, right? And it wasn't all just one linear slope from here to success, right?
Never is.
And lots of challenges along the way. And so I'm not saying, hey, just quit your job, don't tell your wife, and everything's going to work out. But the difference between sort of like, when you become an entrepreneur and you start a business, that's where you can start to really create wealth or what have you. And if you can force yourself past and through the fear, that's when your life will really start turning around and you'll start doing everything you need in order to be successful. And, the leverage you're going to get based on a 9-to-5 job, it's just immeasurable, right? 9-to-5 job, you're going to make exactly how much they pay you plus your bonus. That's it. Maybe a few stock options here and there, but there's no leverage in it, right? You can start a business with a small amount of money and you can grow it to any amount of money, sell it for a huge multiple, and retire wealthy, but you have to be willing to take that first step and just have faith in yourself. And that's really where the success begins, is that step of becoming an entrepreneur. Everything else is a step not to become poor, right?
Yeah,
And, it's right.
Yeah.
Poor avoidance, if you will, right?
Yeah. Jeff Bezos, is quoted as, in baseball, the best you can ever do is score 4 runs. Grand slam, walk-off homer, you score 4 runs, which is great. But in business, you may strike out a lot, but you can score 1,000 runs, 2,000 runs when you hit it, when you finally connect with the ball. And that's the leverage principle that you're talking about. Yeah. So you've exited. Obviously, you're an author, podcast host. Well, plans to start another business? Plans to do this again?
Yeah, because now I'm 61, right? So I don't have another 15 years of building another business in me, right? And, I'm pretty busy doing this integration with the private equity company. And I rolled in, right? Where you take some of the equity and you roll it back into their company. And then when they exit again, then you exit at that point. So I'm here for a few years. At that point, what I'm trying to do is position a world where I can share some of these secrets and knowledge that I've learned with other companies and at events. And, so for me, the highlight of my career would be to spend a couple years doing some public speaking, not necessarily, really for the money in it, but more just I enjoy it so much. It's so fun to tell the stories. There's so many of them. And that would be just a great way to sort of drift off into that sunset and go play pickleball in Florida after that. Right.
Love it. There we go. There we go.
Yeah.
All right. So I always ask, well, one, your storytelling is great. So, and in the book, just the way you go into depth. So I think you would excel at that. I always ask speaking of books, I always ask every guest, what book made a real impact on you, on your life, and maybe even was a pivotal moment, when you set that book down after reading it. Can you share with the listeners what book you would recommend for them that had such a profound impact on you?
Yeah. So the most profound impact was the book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Okay. And, he delves into your ego and, being in your ego and outside your ego and all of that. I mean, I'm not I couldn't write a thesis on his book, but it had such a step function change in the way I approach things and the way I thought of things that it's just, I've gone back to it over and over and over again throughout the years. It's just been, a game changer for me. And the way I look at the way I get involved in decisions and how my ego's involved. And, and I mapped out hours and hours and hours about how my ego would react to selling my business, right? How am I going to react? I've sold the business. What does that mean? I've sold my business. I'm working for them. And now I'm an employee. What does that mean? I've sold the business. I'm an employee and they've given me a job and I don't like that job. How am I going to feel? And what does it mean? Right. And and so much of it is really driven by my ego and not really, because obviously they're going to pay me well and whatever, but I don't like the title. I don't like the power. I don't like this. And, and so I spent so much time and the concepts of Eckhart Tolle, and that is, was invaluable. But on the sort of sales side, it's the book Persuasion, right? And where he talks about the 7 laws of persuasion and, reciprocity and things like that, right? There's so much gold in there, right? Yeah. But definitely The Power of Now is sort of my most favorite one.
Love it. Thank you for the recommendation. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed this. You're so pleasant and obviously very, very successful, but you don't have an ego about you. I'll tell you that. Or at least it doesn't come across that way. So all the work that you've done.
Can I get that in writing for my wife?
Exactly. She's just worried about you quitting the job, right? Yeah. Love it.
Right.
Well, how can people, follow you, get in touch with you, reach out to you? What's the best way? And we'll put that in the show notes too, so that people can.
Yeah. The best way would be to share my website, which will link you to everything else. So glennpoulos.com and links to the podcast, the other podcasts I've been on are there, then all my LinkedIn and Facebook, et cetera. LinkedIn's the best way to interact with me though. So, you can go to my website and go to LinkedIn, or just go to LinkedIn and type in my name and connect with me there. And I'm happy to speak to anybody and quite active on LinkedIn. And that's really my go-to for communicating and stuff.
Great. Well, we'll put that in the show notes. Again, Glenn, thank you so much for the time and your expertise. And just your candor and demeanor. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Roger. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, take care. Thank you so much for tuning into the ThriveMore podcast. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for any resources mentioned during the show. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you have access to the latest and the greatest. I'd also like to remind you to check out our website, ThriveMoreBrands.com. There you'll find information on the brands we support and information on franchising. Thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, always remember to set your intentions for the day and strive to thrive.